All right, good afternoon, everybody. We'll get started. My name is Toban-Zolman. I'm Vice President of Product Development for Cloudability. And welcome to today's session, The Science Behind Choosing Reserved Instances. Got a pretty good turnout, which is not necessarily a surprise. I think there's been a lot of attention paid to RIs over the past year. So today what we're going to really lean into are kind of three core areas. I want to talk through the process of understanding reservations. We're going to look at how reservations are applied and basically how you need to be purchasing reservations. I'm going to talk through simplifying reserved instance purchases while maximizing ROI. So we'll look at some strategies around that. And then finally, kind of end up by looking at recommended approaches to purchasing reservations. So to begin, just to give some context, I guess both to myself and to Cloudability, I thought it'd be helpful to kind of talk through just very briefly how we came to a lot of these best practices that I'm going to discuss. So if you're not familiar with Cloudability, we track cloud spending for over 8,000 companies and have over $500 million in managed cloud spend on our platform. So we've been able to really look at a lot of aggregated trends across all of that data and also really start to understand both how people are currently buying RIs, what's working, what isn't working, and really what the optimum way is to make those purchases. So our application has kind of 5 major feature areas. So to begin, we do spend management. We essentially help organizations get visibility into monthly spending, budget alerts, daily emails. You can dig deeper into our application by using our cost analytics, which a lot of organizations use to do cost allocation and chargeback by using features like cost by tag, looking at service type, things of that sort. And to understand why costs may be going up or down, trending information becomes really helpful, and that's where our usage analytics come into play, where a lot of organizations will look for underutilized instances, instances that may be over-provisioned for the work that they're doing. And we're able to take both our cost data and our usage analytics and use that to drive our RI recommendations. And so our RI purchase analytics and purchase planner really outlines the optimum mix of lights, mediums, and heavies that an organization would need to purchase in order to maximize ROI and get the highest level of cost savings for a particular instance type. And then finally, for large organizations, we offer a host of different enterprise options to make it easier to understand your costs across an organization through organizational roll-ups and account grouping views, things of that sort. So that gives you just a quick sense, I guess, of Cloudability and kind of the level of data that we're operating with in order to kind of come to a lot of these conclusions. So let me kind of jump into it. We're going to start by really working through the science of how you go about all of this. And I thought it'd be interesting kind of throughout the presentation today to kind of throw it back to you guys so that we could kind of see amongst ourselves what different trends are in the group. So I'm curious, show of hands, is your company currently purchasing AWS reservations? So maybe 40%, kind of tough to tell, but maybe 40% of you are. That's maybe a little low compared to what we're seeing across our customer base, but not necessarily surprising in a session on purchasing reserved instances. We've seen a really huge explosion in both the focus on reserved instances in the past year, as well as the number of organizations that are really leveraging those. And I think it comes down to 3 reasons why you see that sort of a trend. First, Amazon has done a pretty good job of educating and marketing around RIs. And so through account managers and SAs, we've seen a lot of organizations really kind of come into the fold in terms of understanding the benefits that a reserved instance can provide in terms of cost saving and capacity. And so we've seen a large uptick, I think, largely due to that. we've also seen as organizations are starting to become more mature as they move on to the cloud, their infrastructure is starting to solidify a little bit. And so buying into a 1 or a 3-year RI isn't quite the same dicey proposition that it may have been as your organization was just starting to move to the cloud. So that's also driven a lot of adoption. And then finally, and this is kind of my favorite as somebody who runs product development, this is the easiest lever to pull to save money. So if you look at how you could build a more efficient application, there's lots of things you could do on the engineering side to creating more efficient auto-scaling, to doing analytics on how you're using instances and try and reduce memory consumption and disk I/O and things so that you can reduce the size of instance. All of that takes a lot of work. And as a guy who's trying to ship features, it's much easier to write a check and cut my bill by 50%. So we've seen a lot of companies just doing that. Rather than commit engineering time to optimizing their infrastructure, they write a check, lower it, and then they can really stomp on the gas and continue to put their efforts in areas that are actually going to drive future revenue for the organization. So those are kind of the types of things that we've really seen drive cloud adoption or drive RI adoption over the past year. But one of the trends that we see kind of over and over is that most people are simply oversimplifying when it comes to reservation purchasing. So there are a couple ways that this is manifesting itself. The first is operationally. And I'll talk through this a little bit, but the approach that people are using to purchase an RI is just too simple. They're making very large buys instead of focusing on what they need at particular moments in time. And that's creating a misalignment between the RIs that they have and the RIs that they actually need. And then the second way that people are oversimplifying purchasing is just oversimplifying the calculation. And so we're going to really dig into the math today, for better or worse, at 4:30 in Las Vegas. But we're going to dig into the math on how you really need to be approaching this to understand the types of reservations that ultimately you need, not the types of reservations that at least make sense on an initial pass. So the implications really of these two types of misalignments, operationally oversimplifying things and oversimplifying the calculation, is that at the end of the day, you have a reduced ROI. You end up with reserved instances that are misaligned to your actual needs. And so, we've all heard kind of the line or seen the stats of if you have a heavy RI, you can save up to 60%. And that's true. If you have the RI that you actually need in the right AZ and applied in the right way, you can save up to 60%. But if you're not utilizing that, then those savings aren't going to materialize. So from an operational standpoint, the way in which we see a lot of people really kind of missing the boat on RIs is by doing this, going all in on really large buys once or twice a year. And the problem that this creates is that it's just not a strategy that mitigates risk. If anything, this exposes the organization to a lot more risk because it creates really large cliffs in reservation levels. So what I mean by this is we've worked with a lot of companies that will literally do an RI buy of, let's say, $1 million. And that $1 million RI buy covers their entire infrastructure for the next year or 3 years, whatever sort of RI buy they make. And that's great. The challenge is it really locks in their entire infrastructure to that type of a footprint. In other words, if they've purchased 50 RIs for an M1X large and they find out over time that the needs of their application are changing and they actually don't need an extra large, they need an 8XL. Well, they've already purchased all of these RIs for an extra large that they kind of have to use now. And so we see a lot of organizations making platform decisions not based on what their application actually needs to be performant, but based on what RIs they've purchased. So that's a real problem. The other issue that we've seen with this approach is while it is the simplest approach in terms of wrapping your head around what you need as an organization, it also has a really large price tag associated to it. And so trying to get that pushed through finance can be challenging, and it's a large cash expenditure to make all at one shot. So we're going to talk through some strategies that you can utilize today to really start to spread out how you're purchasing RIs, basically make those purchases in smaller chunks, and as a result, ultimately get higher ROI because over time, things are aligned much more closely to what you need. So rather than having your entire infrastructure come up for renewal once a year, every month you have some RIs that are expiring. And every month you can decide, do we want to replace these RIs with the same ones we had before, or are those misaligned to what we need for our infrastructure? And then you can change those and tweak them and not have big cliffs, not have your infrastructure get misaligned with your RIs, and ultimately it works much better. So another kind of quick show of hands related to this, those of you that are using RIs, how frequently are you purchasing those RIs? Once a year? Anybody doing that? Twice a year? Quarterly? Few. Monthly? Anybody doing that? Anyone doing it just purely based on need? Yeah, so clearly the room is trending toward taking this approach of doing really large buys. And I get it. We understand totally why you would do that. But ultimately, it's not the strongest strategy over the long term to keep your RIs aligned with your infrastructure. So let's take a couple of minutes here. What I want to do is kind of take a step back. And I'm calling this Reservations 101. Maybe it's like a 501 course. But ultimately, what I want to do is define terms so that we're all talking about the same thing in the same way. Because once we get into the math exercise, it's going to be important to understand exactly how RIs get applied in each of these various scenarios so that you understand kind of what's driving all of these different things. So to begin, let's talk about what is a reservation. Seems like a logical place to start. And we'll advance quickly from here, trust me. So a reservation allows you to reserve resources and capacity for 1 or 3 years in a particular region in exchange for a lower overall unit cost. That's a mouthful. A simpler way of saying it is you spend a little bit of money up front, and Amazon will reduce your hourly rate by a little bit. Spend more money up front, and they'll reduce your rate a little bit more. So that's really the mechanics of how this works. And we'll talk about how this gets applied in each individual scenario, but fundamentally, that's what we're talking about. The key thing to note in this definition is that when you purchase a reservation, you're really reserving both the resource and capacity. So you're getting cost savings, and you're getting you're reserving the capacity that you need in a particular AZ. So I'll drill into this in just a bit. The other thing that I want to point out is typically when people talk about reserved instances, really the focus is on compute, on EC2. Amazon also offers reservations for databases and for CDN. So if you're using CloudFront, you can purchase reservations around CloudFront. There's a lot of savings to be had on the database side. So this is an area that a lot of people don't really pay attention to. But I mean, if you think about how you're operating databases in many instances, they're on pretty much all the time. And so if you can reserve capacity around that and get cost savings, you're in a much better position, and it's a very easy place, low-hanging fruit to save money. Okay? So why would you make a reservation? Well, the obvious reason here is you can lower the cost of resources you're already using. Pretty simple. Reservations can provide substantial cost savings versus on-demand pricing. Let's look at an example. So this is a table that breaks down cost savings of an RI versus on-demand. And this is somewhat oversimplified, but will work perfect for our purposes today. So this is for an M1X large running Linux. And let's kind of take this column by column. So the very first column that you see here is the annual utilization rate. And I've kind of broken this down based on several samples, 20%, 40%, 60, 80, 100, okay? So you look at the second column, And let's say that I am using an instance 20% of the time, and I have purchased a light RI for it. I'm going to save about 25% in that scenario. And if you follow that down the column, if I'm using an instance 100% of the time, and I have a light RI purchased, I'm going to save about 49%. So not too bad. If you move over a column, let's look at mediums. So with a medium RI, if you use it 20% of the time, you're actually going to lose money. It's going to cost you 7% more for that instance if you have a medium RI. And the reason for that, and we'll kind of break this all apart here in a bit, is when you purchase an RI, you are getting I said you pay a little bit up front and you get a little bit off the hourly rate. Well, that little bit up front, you really have to amortize that out over all of the hours that you're using that RI. And if you're not using, or using the instance rather, if you're not using that instance very much, then that upfront fee is going to essentially increase the effective hourly rate for it. So you have to, when you look at mediums and heavies, you have to use those a fairly significant amount of time in order to actually reap the cost savings. So you can see here, if you're using the instance 40% of the time, you're going to save about 33%. Things are looking good there, but if you compare it to the light, you would actually be saving 40% on the light. So there's kind of some break-even points here, or thresholds, as you move up the amount of utilization, where you want to move from a light to a medium and ultimately to a heavy. Okay? So the way this kind of maps out, if you're using your instance, let's say 60% of the time, it would make more sense to go to a medium. If you're using your instance, let's say 80% of the time, it's going to make more sense to go to a heavy. So these numbers are generalized. The reality is, if you look at the combination of instance type, availability zone, operating system, light, medium, and heavy RI, there are over 2,000 different combinations of break-even points for these. Yeah, question? Yeah, great question. So the question, just to repeat it, how am I classifying or how am I defining annual utilization rate? So the way I'm defining this is that the instance is in a running state. So it means that 20% of the hours of the year, this instance or an instance that meets this criteria was running so that an RI could actually be applied to it. You got it. Yeah, question.
So let's say the same example, running 60% of the time, and at a medium, you're saving 46%. Are you now incorporating the cost of you being charged for the instance price that's not currently on? And by that I mean is Amazon charges you upfront cost on that server regardless if it's on or off. Because that would significantly lower that percentage of savings.
Yeah, so I'll get into this in literally like 2 slides. I mean, you bring up an interesting point, and let me unpackage that for people with some graphics. Cool. Okay, so yeah, back to this. This is essentially kind of walks you through where, roughly speaking, those break-even points happen. Generally, I think it's safe to say, depending on the instance type and the AZ, somewhere between, let's say, 25 and 40% utilization rate, it's going to make sense to have a light. 35 to 50 depends, again, on the AZ. A medium is going to make sense. And then for heavies, we see that anywhere from the high 40s to the low 60s. It's going to make sense there. Okay? All right, so second reason why you may want to make a reservation. You may want to lock in future capacity in an availability zone. So this is really helpful if you have auto-scaling and you experience a lot of bursts or spikes in usage. So if let's say you're running most of your infrastructure in US East 1A, and you're running a social networking app, let's say, and so as things start to go viral or Facebook posts hit or whatever it is, you see these massive spikes in usage. And so you auto-scale up to support those. Awesome. That works great unless there's no more capacity in that AZ. And so reserved instances give you the ability to reserve that capacity. And so that's really helpful if you have a situation where you're scaling up capacity. You know that you've got a reservation there. So Amazon does not guarantee that you will have access to this, but it basically puts you first in line. Yeah, question?
What degree real-world do you see capacity issues?
So the question was, to what degree in kind of a real-world setting do we actually see capacity issues? I would not say that we see it often by any stretch. I don't know that I would want to venture a percentage. It's not often. I think Amazon does a pretty good job of kind of staying ahead of that. The big issue, I think, where we see issues like this are with apps that are incredibly spiky. You may have 10 instances and you spike up to 1,000 instances, to handle some sort of peak demand. And so those are cases where you're looking at really large increases where you're going to want to make sure you've got some capacity guarantee. Okay. So the third thing here is kind of a newer trend that we've seen, which is reserving capacity in another region just in case. So the scenario here is demand could cause a run on capacity in a particular AZ. And so you may find yourself needing to move from US East to US West. And if you're in that boat, chances are other people are too. And so if you all are crowding into US West at the same time, let's say there's a hurricane on the East Coast, you want to make sure that you're first in line to get that capacity as everybody rushes in there. So the cheapest way to do that is to have some light reservations sitting in US West. You may be using them, you may not. But if you're treating that as an insurance policy, it's a fairly inexpensive way to kind of guarantee that or not guarantee, but at least give you a seat at the table, so to speak, as if there's ever a run on capacity. All right, so let's kind of unpackage some of this a little bit. Quick question, though, as I advance too far. There we go. For those of you that are purchasing RIs currently, how many of you are doing it for cost savings? Yeah, everybody. How many for capacity? 3. Okay. Yeah, so that's about what we see across our customer base too. But I think that's starting to change, where people are starting to pay more attention to the capacity side of a reservation. To make sure that they've got what they need as things start to grow. So let me get into kind of the next little nuance to RIs, which is reserved instance pricing. So how the components apply, and this kind of loops back to the question that we had earlier. So when you buy an RI, there's essentially 2 components. You've got your upfront fee, and you've got your hourly usage fee. The bigger upfront fee you pay, the lower your hourly usage fee. Okay, and they have 3 tiers, a light, medium, and a heavy for that. The nuance or the difference here really comes into play on the minimum usage level column. So if you buy a light reservation and you use that reservation 2 hours during the month, you will be billed for 2 hours of usage. If you buy a medium and you use that instance 2 hours during the month, you will be billed for 2 hours. If you buy a heavy, you will get a bill on the first of the month for 744 hours, or 720, depending on how many days there are in the month. So you are paying for 100% of the hours in the month, whether you use 2 hours or use 720 hours. So that changes the calculation a little bit when you get to a heavy RI. So let's just kind of work through an example here. Let's say, yeah, question.
Just before you said that if you have an RI that happens to fill in the utilized capacity, you're not guaranteed to get it. If you have a heavy and you've already been used and billed for it, are you still not guaranteed to get it?
Correct. Yep. So let's unpackage this yellow box a little bit. I'll use M1X large as an example. So M1X large running Linux, US East. Your on-demand rate for that would be about 48 cents an hour. So if you bought a heavy, you would pay about $1,350, I think it's $1,352 up front as your upfront fee. And that drops your hourly rate down to 11.2 cents an hour. So 11.2 cents compared to 48 cents is pretty good. You amortize out that upfront fee over the entire year. Let's say you run at 100% of the time. That bumps really your effective hourly rate, is what I'll call it, at least for this presentation. It bumps that up to about 26 cents. So 26 cents versus 48, still pretty good. But that's assuming that you use that instance 100% of the time. So let's say you only use it 50%. So you only use it 50% of the hours of the year. You're still paying $2,333 for that, which is 100% of the hours of the year. If you only use it, though, 50% of the time, your effective hourly rate is 53 cents an hour. So you're actually paying more than you would for on-demand because you're not using it enough. So for heavies, you really have to pay attention to what that break-even point is, because if you're under that, I mean, obviously you're not going to break even, but if you're not confident, I guess, that you will maintain that level of usage for an extended period of time, then it's a little bit riskier proposition. With a light or a medium, you have to, if you no longer need that reservation, you'll eat the upfront cost, but you're not going to continue to incur costs month after month for the reservation, and with a heavy, you will. So a little bit different dynamic. Yeah, question?
So would it be safe to say that if you have a system that's on 100% your go-to is edge?
Yeah. Yeah, that's totally a safe assumption. Okay. So let me get into one final thing here before we do our math lesson for the day. I want to talk through how reservations are applied. So reserved instances are purchased for an instance type, like M1X large, in a particular availability zone, like US East 1A, and an operating system, like Linux. So those are the three things that should all be essentially factored in for where each RI is applied. Reservations are applied each hour. So you purchase an RI for M1X large and US East 1A running Linux. Amazon is going to go through your infrastructure at the end of every hour and say, did I have an instance, an M1X large in US East 1A running Linux? Yes or no? Yes? Awesome. You get a discount. No? All right. They won't apply it. So the reason that's kind of an important distinction to understand in terms of how they're actually applying these reservations is because it will affect how we purchase RIs. In other words, we need to pay attention to how RIs are running every single hour, or how instances are running every single hour. It also means that you are purchasing a reservation for an M1X large and US East 1A running Linux. That's all you're purchasing. You're not purchasing a reservation for a particular instance ID. So we've had lots of customers get really frustrated because a colleague has stolen their discount. Because their colleague fired up an instance that was running in the same account, in the same availability zone, and the discount applied to their instance. Amazon doesn't know whose instances are whose in your company. They just are literally cycling through all of the instances that are running, based on that criteria, and applying the reservation discount. So there's not a notion of stealing, and there's not a notion of an individual instance owning that RI. You're purely purchasing capacity. Yeah? How do they distinguish?
So I could have a
you can essentially, the simple way to answer that is essentially assume it cascades down. You apply your heavies, then you apply your mediums, then you apply your lights. So if you have a heavy and a light for one AZ, and you have 2 instances running, it will apply the heavy first, or all of your heavies to get the maximum discount, then apply all of your mediums, then apply all of your lights. Make sense? Okay.
So one size doesn't fit all?
It's a fair statement, a broad statement, but a fair statement, yeah. So, all right, a couple other things here to talk through. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this. Yeah, go ahead. Yeah, that's an excellent question that needs some unpacking. So I'm going to table it for about 5 minutes, and then we'll get to it. Because that's really the crux of the underlying math, is how that gets applied. Yeah. So I'm not going to spend a ton of time on this. You can talk to me afterwards if you really want to unpack it. But if you're using a consolidated billing scenario, and you have an instance running in a linked account, let's say account A and account B, let's say you bought the RI in account A, you're running an instance in account B, so you don't have any instance running in account A that you could apply that to. The way Amazon handles this is they will apply the discount to the instance in account B. So account B can inherit, in other words, that cost savings. So that's really nice. The thing to understand is you can inherit cost savings, but you don't inherit the capacity reservation. So in other words, if the data center starts to fill up and account B starts, you're applying reservations to account B, in other words, and you start to auto-scale up, you don't have any capacity guarantee. It doesn't move you to the front of the line or anything like that. All of the capacity benefit stays in the account in which you purchased it in. All right, so let's, and there's a lot of other nuances around all of that if you have questions, feel free to kind of ping me after and we can dig into it. So let me talk through one final piece here, which is how you go about modifying reserved instances. This is a fairly new addition by Amazon, a very welcome addition. It makes RIs much more flexible, but it also makes it a little bit more complex to kind of wrap your head around all of the options. So Amazon now allows you to apply to transfer a reservation from one availability zone to another. In other words, you could have an RI in US East 1A, and you could move that to US East 1B. Pretty cool. And really helps as you kind of build out your infrastructure, especially if you're growing, to get things aligned exactly where you need them. This is not automatic, all right? You have to apply to make this transition happen. The next thing that they've introduced is what I call a trade-in program. So you can trade in existing reserved instances for a different size in the same family. If you're saying, what the heck is a family? M1 would be a good example. So M1 small, M1 medium, large, up to 8XL, those are all a family. And Amazon has published a normalization scheme for these where they've assigned a point value to every instance in a family. So an M1 small is 1 point. An M1 medium is 2 points. An M1 large is 4 points. An M1X large is 8 points. You kind of get the pattern. So what this means is if you have a M1X large reservation that's sitting idle, you could essentially break that into 2 M1 large, or you had an M1X large, you could break that into 2 M1 larges, or you could break it into 8 M1 smalls. So it gives you flexibility to adjust that out to really align it to your infrastructure. Yeah, so if you're going down, I mean, it's essentially, that's why they've done the normalization factor. If you're going up, then you essentially are paying a prorated fee because your fixed upfront cost ramps up. So there's some hit there. So if you do this, Amazon has a whole calculator, an interface that you go through to do it, and it factors, does all the math and calculates all of that for you and kind of sets it up. But in principle, that's essentially what we're doing. Yeah. Define after the fact, like after you've purchased it? Yeah, so this is, let's say 6 months ago I bought a whole bunch of extra large reservations and we've downsized our infrastructure. I could start breaking those into larges. And then it will apply for the remainder of that reservation period. Sorry, can you speak up a little bit? Mm-hmm. It's not retroactive. Yeah, so if you, it's not going to go back from the beginning of the reservation term, which is 1 or 3 years, and kind of apply that back through your infrastructure. It just, what it is, from the moment you make the switch forward is how the application works. Okay. Having fun yet? Good stuff, right? Okay, so the fine print on these transfers don't happen automatically, and they're not guaranteed. It's all, once again, based on available capacity. So if you want to transfer to from US East 1B to 1A, they have to have enough excess capacity in that availability zone in order to apply the reservation. Okay. All right, so let's get into how you go about calculating your reservation needs. So this is a simplified example, just so that we can kind of make sense of what we're looking at. What we are going to do is essentially assume that a month has 10 hours in it, just to make our lives a little bit easier, okay? And what this table does is it breaks down the hour of the month and how many instances you had running each of those hours. So the first hour of the month we had 4, the second 6, the third 0, etc. This is relevant because RIs are applied at an hourly level, all right? So we're going to unpackage this and then look at a real-world example of where this could really affect the type of purchase you would make. So what we want to do with this is break it into an hourly frequency distribution of instance levels. So in our software, this is literally what we're doing behind the scenes when we make an RI recommendation, is we look at the running instance count that happens every hour and the frequency of occurrence. So there were no instances running 1 hour of the month, which remember this is a 10-hour month, so that's 10% of the time. There was 1 instance running 9 hours of the month, so 90%. So at least 1 instance running 9 hours of the month. There was at least 5 instances running 6 hours of the month, or 60%. So you kind of get this, right? Okay. So how does this apply to buying RIs? Well, what you want to do is you want to look at the percentage of time that a particular instance count occurs during the month, and guess what? That's what you buy your RIs for. So this is again oversimplified, but let's say 60% is the break-even point for a heavy. 5 instances, 5 instances met that criteria, so there would be 5 RIs purchased. Further down, you have 7 instances running at least 40% of the time, which is the break-even point for a medium. So you would buy 2 medium reserved instances, the 7 minus the 5 that you've already purchased for heavies. And then you do the same thing for light. So that there are at least 8 instances running 20% of the time. You've already bought 2 mediums, 5 heavies, so you would buy 1 light. okay? This seems really complicated. Why in the world would you go through this much trouble? This is why. So this is a screenshot from a report in our application that's looking at utilization rates over the last month. And so over the last month, all of these instances were running 94.27% of the time. Awesome. Let's buy heavies. That's clear. We should have heavies if we expect that level of utilization to continue. The problem is it gets really squirrely once your utilization rates drop down to like 30%. So let's take a real simple example. Let's say I've got 3 instances that are running 30% of the time. What sort of RI should I buy for that? Well, the simple answer would be, well, you buy 3 lights because they're each running at 30%. That's above the break-even point for a light RI. That is one approach. But what we don't know is, were they running at the same time? If they were running at the same time, then you have to have 3 reservations in order for that cost savings to apply. But let's say, for some reason, the first instance runs the first week of the month. The second instance runs the second week of the month. And the third runs the third. Amazon is cycling through every single hour of the month and seeing, is there an instance running that I could apply an RI to, yes or no? If those instances don't overlap, it would be much more cost-effective to buy 1 heavy because you're effectively having 90% utilization. So you buy 1 heavy, you're saving not 20%, but you're saving 60%, maybe 50% since it's only 90% utilized. But that's a much more cost-effective way to structure that out. The problem is very few people look at things this way. And so we see this all the time. People will look at an aggregated level of utilization, like we're seeing here, and then buy an RI for each of those. If you did that, if you had 3 instances that were not running at the same time and you bought 3 lights, you're throwing money away because it's only going to apply 1 of those reservations at any given time. The other 2 are total waste. So it's really critical when you're trying to figure out RI allocation to do this essentially based on a frequency distribution and look at the an hourly histogram, if you will, of all of your instance levels every single hour of the month and of the year. Does that make sense? I realize that's kind of complicated, but yeah, question.
Can you restate how you built frequency distribution again? Now I understand.
Yeah. So let me just kind of back up and kind of step through it again real quick. So this is every hour of the month, how many instances we're running that hour. And then we convert that into a simple frequency distribution. So how many times at least 1 instance was running in the month? That's 9. How many times at least 2 were running? Again, that's 9, so 90%. And you just build that out across all of your instance counts up to your max instance count and figure out how often each instance count occurs during the month. And then you essentially map those in, to the break-even points for lights, mediums, and heavies.
So Amazon knows our utilization. Is there any kind of recommendation engine that you can just say, take my last month's usage and tell me what I should buy?
So Amazon has, they have Trusted Advisor, which is one of their products that basically just lists out recommendations. A lot of our customers use that as well. There's not the underlying math of how they're generating those recommendations isn't transparent, but my assumption is they're using something like this. But that's what Amazon offers. I'll step you guys through the approach that we took to solve this in Cloudability's application. Because we really tried, I mean, this is tough to wrap your head around. And it's tough in this really simple example of what, 12 instances running in a fictitious 10-hour month. If you've got 3,500 instances across a whole bunch of AZs, auto-scaling going up and down, things get a little tougher to wrap your head around then. So let me show you kind of how we unpack this. So this is a screenshot from our application, the Reserved Instance Planner. This is kind of the initial page that you see as you come in. And you can see each row here, we're essentially identifying instance type, availability zone, and OS. So the three kind of criteria that I've talked about thus far. We identify how many current RIs you have, how many you need, and what your gap looks like. And then we give you a quick hit on some financials. So what your upfront costs are, what your estimated savings are going to be, and then I'll drill into the details here. So the net, if you look at the top here for this account, we're basically recommending 960 reservation purchases. And the upfront fee there is going to be about $500,000. But at the end of the reservation term, you would save over $300,000 versus on demand. So there's an initial investment to get, to buy in essentially to the lower price. But the percentage savings, and you'll see this in some additional screenshots, really can be fairly significant in terms of actually, breaking out those cost savings and driving your costs down. Okay. So let's look at some details. What we've done so that people can actually wrap their head around all of this is we've tried to make how we're generating these numbers as transparent as possible. So what we literally do is we build a histogram that shows every single hour of the reporting period, so up to 90 days, and shows the instance count. And based on that, then, we overlay how many heavies you should buy, how many mediums, and how many lights. So let me kind of step through this a little bit. So this is a histogram for heavies. And it looks like, if I go back here, it looks like we've got about 70, I'll call it 70 for the purposes of the presentation, 70 instances running at least 65, we'll say, again, just kind of using round numbers, but running at least 65% of the hours of the month. So we buy heavies to cover all of that. But there's still peaks that are happening here. So for those peaks, then, we do another pass. And we've got an additional 5 instances or so an hour that are running, we'll call it 40% of the hours of the month. So we'll recommend heavies for those. And then we've got maybe another 4 instances. So we're now at like, let's call it 79 instances an hour, all right, that are running at least 30% of the hours of the month. So we do lights for those. So we literally are trying to help you visually unpack how all of this works and how it's going to get applied. And then from there, we give you the financials that matter. So this is for a single heavy purchase. Yeah, question.
So with the part above, the part that was labeled as lights, that would be considered like on-demand?
Yeah, totally. That's a great question. So the gray area up above, you're paying full on-demand price for that. But that's okay. It doesn't occur frequently enough for you to get any sort of cost savings by having a reservation.
So maybe this is outside the scope of the session, we talked about reserves, but would it matter like whether you were using on-demand or spot at that point, like where it's happening so infrequently? Obviously, you can get to that point and then you have enough elasticity that like you can use either.
It's a relevant question to ask. I mean, in terms of a cost comparison standpoint, we're essentially using on-demand as our baseline for cost. If you're using spot, that changes that baseline, and it again becomes a variable baseline, in terms of what you're willing to pay at a given point in time. So to get to the root of your question, though, in terms of does it make sense to use spot instances for those, it could. It depends a lot on your application and if it's suitable to throw spot instances into the mix when you're really at peak capacity. You know, when you're really getting hammered, do you want to be relying on spot to handle that excess, you know, excess traffic or, you know, whatever it is? So tough to answer. I think it's going to differ for every application. Yeah. Green shirt first. So I don't believe there's a way to apply reservations on the spot side. I mean, it's a different marketplace. So you could buy reservations for that peak, but you're not going to make any money on it. I mean, you're going to be underwater because that it doesn't happen frequently enough. Yeah, and then you got a question. At some level, we have. I mean, so we've got all of this data aggregated, you know, across $600 million or so of spend and 8,000 customers. So absolutely, we're looking at, we leverage that data as much as we can to look for trends. In this particular case, it doesn't change the math, really. You know what I mean? So I think we've got data in terms of how effective RIs are for a lot of our customers, but the break-even points are the break-even points. So how people are implementing that, or you know, the behavior around it hasn't really. I mean, it doesn't really affect the recommendations that we're doing. Provable result. Yeah. And there's a couple different ways that we cycle through this, which I'll talk about here in a second to kind of explain how we do that. So let me talk through a couple things here real quick, and then we can kind of unpack that. So these are the financials that we kind of present. What your total one-year on-demand cost would be, your cost if you bought the RIs we're recommending, what your estimated savings would be, both in terms of raw dollars and a percentage. And then we show you what your upfront fee is, and we amortize that fee into the term of the RI to show you your amortized monthly cost. This is what finance guys are asking for. They love the chart as well because it shows cash flow-wise exactly what they're going to be up against. Because that's really tough for a finance guy to kind of wrap his head around. You're telling me I've got to throw down $16,000, but it makes sense. And you can see by month 7, you've broken even and then you're saving from that point on. So if you've got a confidence level in your usage rate, this is a really effective presentation tool for kind of pushing this through a CFO. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's a fair point. I mean, both RIs and on-demand Amazon is reducing cost on those over time. I mean, we update our app kind of on a live basis to make sure we have all of that captured. That's one of the reasons why a lot of people shy away from a 3-year RI is, one, you're locked into a price that in 24 months on-demand could actually be lower than that. And 2, you're locked into an instance type that in 3 years, you know, Amazon continues to introduce newer, faster, better instance types that you may no longer want to be on that sort of an instance type. So we see a lot of companies leaning more toward 1-year RIs for that reason. If it's something that you know is going to be static and stable and you're turning it on and, you know, closing the door and not going to worry about it for a long time, then a 3-year RI does make sense in those contexts. So here's kind of how this nets out. Just a couple more slides here, and I can take just a couple questions. So this recommendation is based on 17 instances running 83.18% of the hours in the reporting period, which is higher than the break-even point of 63.12. So, I mean, we're calculating this down to, you know, a fairly specific level so that you can see exactly where you are in comparison to break-even points. And then we identify action items. This is awesome, but also really complicated to try and do on your own in many cases. So we're identifying what you should purchase. We're identifying what you should transfer. So transfer 8 M1 large heavy reservations from US East West 1A to 1B. So that is that AZ, move between AZ program that Amazon has introduced. And then finally, we identify instance or reservations that you should trade in. So convert 1 M1X large heavy reservation to 2 M1 large RIs in a particular AZ. So we can essentially unpackage all of this for you and make sure that not only are you buying the proper mix of lights, mediums, and heavies, but if you already have RIs that are out there, that you're moving them to make sure that you're applying them in the most effective way. So final thing here is kind of to summarize our recommended approaches to buying reservations. So first, purchase decisions on hourly instance counts of each instance type per availability zone. Do not aggregate the data. If you walk away from the session with anything, I hope that's it. It's going to save you a lot of inefficient and misplaced RI purchases if you take this approach. The second thing is do frequent reservation purchases to help maximize cost efficiency. This is really important to not have those huge cliffs, but to buy incrementally so that over time you have more levers to pull. You've got levers to pull every month in terms of RIs that are expiring and you can move them or you can change them within the family. That's a lot of different ways you can constantly realign the RIs versus doing $1 million buy and 12 months later you start all over again.
Is that another reason to try to limit the number of families you think?
Could be. You could make an argument for that. I mean, I think the reality is I'm a strong advocate for getting the right instance for the use case rather than trying to stuff your app to work into something that's convenient from a financial standpoint.
No, I get that, but one of everything.
Sure. Yeah. Don't over-purchase heavy reservations. Utilize light and medium to handle volatility in your usage. This is a really big deal. We see a lot of companies that we talk to say, I'm only buying heavies. And that's great, but you're not really going to get ROI on that if you're buying excess RIs for the low spots in your utilization level. And then finally, if capacity reservations are important to you, utilize light reservations to hold capacity in specific AZs. So treat it as an insurance policy. Okay? So there's a lot here, guys. We're literally, I guess, out of time. Thanks a ton. Come see us in booth 414. Here's my email address. I'm happy to answer questions as you start to look at this in more depth. And please fill out an evaluation form. reInvent would really like feedback on all the sessions. Thanks a lot. Have a good evening.